Hey, my name is Grogan, and I'm here to talk to you today about this idea of evolution. I don't want to make this long. I want to actually make it pretty short so that you can share it with your friends and kind of get the words around. Because I really think this is one of the most important ideas that there is out there today that keeps us from really experiencing life fully. To me, that means Jesus Christ, and that means being a Christian. To other people, it might mean other things. But the belief in evolution itself gnaws at the core of a human being, because what it does is it tells you that you're nothing more than an accident. And I don't believe that. So I want to first talk about Charles Darwin. Because Charles Darwin was the founder of the theory of evolution. In 1859, he published a book called The Origin of the Species, in which he declared that human beings were incremental evolutions of another species. In other words, that we had evolved over time into what we are now. And at that time, this theory was so different. It was actually like if I came up to you and said, you evolved from a tape recorder. Now, you would look at me and say, you're crazy. Well, the scientific world at the time said, well, you know, you're crazy. But there were some scientists that wanted to believe this. Let's look at what Charles Darwin thought. Look at what he looked at when he was doing this research. See, he went to the Galapagos Islands and he was examining some different creatures there. One in particular was these finches that he was looking at. And he noticed that depending on the food source that was available to them, that they would change the size of their beaks. So one island would have these bigger beaks, and then one island would have these smaller beaks. And he thought to himself, well, maybe that's how we evolved. Maybe over time, because of different food sources and because of different environmental factors, this new information was added to our genetic code to change the way we look. And now, over many years, we are now where we are today. Now, see, there was a problem with that because at the time, Charles Darwin couldn't look into the cell. What you see on the Galapagos Island is not evolution at all. All it is a different expression of something that's already in the cell. See, Charles Darwin thought that new information would be added over time because that's the only thing that could account from a human being rising out of nothing. But what was actually happening was that different information in the cell that already existed was being expressed at the appropriate time. Now, see, to me, if there was information that wasn't being expressed, kind of hiding in the cell, waiting for the right time, that to me would point out that maybe there was an intelligence that was behind what was happening on the Galapagos Island. But see, Darwin couldn't see in the cell, and it wasn't his fault. He didn't jump to that conclusion. He was just looking at what he did and the evidence that he had, and he was trying to interpret that evidence, which is what scientists do. But now, years later, when we can actually look into the cell and we understand that there's genetic material in us that's sometimes not expressed. Like, for instance, I had genetic material in me that would have me have dark skin. But as you can see, I don't have dark skin. I had genetic material in me that would have me have dark eyes. But as you can see, I don't have dark eyes. So what he was actually experiencing was a phenomenon called adaptation, not evolution at all. It was simply different information in the already existing genetic code that was being expressed at the right time. When the bird needed a big beak, he had a big beak. When the bird needed a small beak, he had a small beak. Because over time, the ones that expressed the right genetic code won out. Now, you can't explain an entire new species this way. And that's the problem with Charles Darwin's theory. Because when you look at that, there's no information being added. It's just simply information being expressed at the appropriate time. Which again, to me, points back that there was an intelligence that was behind the information in the first place. But the problem that we see with Darwin's theory is that there's gaps. There's these huge fossil gaps. You see one species and it's abundant, and you see another species and it's abundant, but the very theory of adaptation and the survival of the fittest that Darwin came up with would say that there should be millions and millions of fossils in between, but they're not. We see species after species after species as complete species. They're not in transitional mode. They're not in transitional shape. But to take over an entire species, there would have to be millions of these transitional fossils in the fossil record, and there are not. And Darwin understood this, and he said it as one of the biggest weaknesses of his theory was the fossil record. And he believed that over time the fossil record would prove his theory, and it hasn't. If really species replace species after species after species, then why are all these better adaptations dying off? Why at some point do they just decide to die? Why do the apes still exist and the man still exists, but nothing in between, which was supposed to be better than the ape? That, to me, is a fundamental flaw in the theory. Not only is it not in the fossil record, but it doesn't exist today. And if you look at adaptation, if you look at the theory that Darwin had, then you would expect to see a bunch of apes that might have an adaptation that makes them survive better than apes. Not only that, but since we have been studying the world and studying the fossil record and studying things, we have not seen a single species evolve. Not one. So if we really are just accidents, just process of evolution, then there's nothing that separates us. We are no better than apes. Human beings are just purposeless, walking around the earth till we die. That's the very thing, ladies and gentlemen, that's destroying our society. It's this belief in a whole world view that brings us nowhere. And if there was evidence, and if there was real science behind it, then I might look at those people and say, okay, I understand what you're doing. I understand where you're going. But see, these people, they're not basing this on science. They're not basing it on evidence. They're basing it on a desire to believe what they've been taught before, which was taught to them, which was made up by a man, looking at evidence that he didn't even interpret right. That's where this worldview comes from. That's where this evolutionary worldview comes from. But before that, there was no doubt there was a difference between a man and an ape. There was no doubt that there was something in us that was special, that made us different as people. And I hope this video helps you question evolution, so that you can go back and look at what they're really basing these theories on, and question and put them to the test, and force science to answer these questions